Okay. um, since I cannot stop thinking about this, I have made some revisions to the flowchart that currently exists, and it's down here in the bottom. It's called multiple borrowers. And once we get this thought out fully, uh, it could probably replace what exists in flowchart. So I just wanted to run through how this would work. Installation, nothing changed. So if we start with authentication, um, the CTA element is rendered in the location of the root elements that were added to their HTML. They click on the CTA whether they've accepted or sorry, granted access. So they've accepted terms and conditions in the past or not. That all comes from that identify endpoint we've already got that data. Once they've accepted terms, we go ahead and call Lendio authorize user. So we do not have a JWT token yet, an embedded JWT token. And in this flow, this is still assuming that we're going to be able to accept from the third party a login and their own access token, whatever that means, so that we're not doing a full OAuth 2 handshake where we have to go to the authorization endpoint, return a token, and then pass the token that we exchange from their session back up to them. And we're just storing that in our Lendio object that is installed on the window. So we're just pulling from, I'm calling it local storage here, but it really means I'm pulling it from the DOM app, what they previously had provided, and we're going to hit the embedded service, the authorized endpoint. This authorized endpoint is using the partner authorized endpoint. And so what we have is the partner ID, the login, and the access token. That ID allows us to determine which service we will be using in order to make a request. So in the case of DNB, that partner ID will allow us to determine, this is a DNB provider. So we're going to use our DNB service to reach out to them, providing that payload with the login and their access token. And they're going to tell us whether the token we just provided them is still active. They're going to send back their user object. It'll have their name and their email, maybe some other goodies, who knows? But basically, the minimum that we're expecting is a name and email. And then it could have one of two things. It could either be a collection of organizations, um, and depending on the provider, obviously, they can send us back however they want. Our service would then, depending on what provider we're making a request to, it would turn it into either an array of organizations, which would be, organization data objects, or an array of DUNS numbers. So only in the case of DNB, they're just going to send us back a DUNS number or DUNS numbers. Whether it's one or many or none, we're just going to put it in an array. So the response to that access, that third-party request, was the token valid? If no, we can stop right there. If it was, we can go ahead and create an embedded user if one did not exist already. If it did exist, no need to create the user. If then we're going to generate a access token using this partner's client credentials that we have stored in our embedded table, in our partner table, and the secret that's stored in the table is encrypted. So we can go ahead and generate an access token so that we can start making requests to embedded API, and then we're going to use that access token that was created to mint our JWT. So in that JWT will be the user that was just created. It'll be their name, it'll be their ID, it'll be the partner ID. If they had a borrower selected, we would have that as well, but they don't yet. So let's forget what I said about borrower. It basically has some user data on it, some partner data on it, and that access token. So in the case of there being organizations or DUNs returned from this request, so they've passed us in organizations or DUNs, we would go ahead and hit this bootstrap endpoint. So this would be in public API. If there were no DUNs that came back or no organizations that came back from this third party, so meaning they don't have any org data in this implementation, we would say, does our embedded user have a Lendio user ID? So if they have a Lendio user ID, well, then we know that they have a borrower, or at least we have the ability to look up a borrower. So if they do have a Lendio user ID, we don't have to send them all the way back to the front end to input an organization. We can go ahead and make a bootstrap request just with that Lendio user ID. So we're passing in to this bootstrap the user object that just came back. So that user object would be a combination of our user data from the embedded service. So if there was a Lendio user ID, and the user data from this third party in the event that we need to create a user. It would also potentially have a borrower ID coming from it. And so in this case, we would probably put in another conditional here, but let me just explain it. I guess the chart is not fully complete. I'm adding this borrower ID ability so that we can have something called active borrower ID or last borrower ID that was used. And we can come up with our own conditional logic whereby when a user revisits their embedded experience, if they already have gone through this process and they've already selected an organization slash borrower to apply on behalf of, when they come back, I believe what we should do is go ahead and assume they're coming back to interact with the same borrower. In the front end, once we've bootstrapped that last borrower that they used, if their intention were something different, so if their intention were to start an application for a different borrower or a new organization, we would give them the ability to do that on the front end. So this authorized post could either pass in this authorized post rather, could either pass in a borrower ID, or we could have logic that just sends it back because it's stored on the user that they have a borrower ID or last used borrower ID. And so in that case, we would just default to that until we had another authorization request that overrided that. And how do we override that? I guess that's up to us. And so it could be a property in the original request where its override is true, could be a query parameter, whatever we want to do, so that we don't default to that last used borrower. But that's just an idea. Let's talk about it. And then also in this bootstrap, there is an array of either DUNs or an array of organization objects. So it's an array of DUNs numbers, even if it's a length of 1, or an array of organizations, even if it's a length of 1 or 0. So the only time that a DUNs array would come through is if it were a length of 1 or greater. And the only time an organization's array would come through is if there were no DUNS numbers to provide and the organization, and that's it. So if there's ever DUNS, there's no organization array. That would be the expectation. And if there are no DUNS, there would be an organization array. And if it's an empty array, it means that we need to determine whether or not this user already exists, and if they don't, they need to give us input. So essentially, the first thing that this endpoint does is, with the user that was provided, there's an email in there. Does this user already exist? And in the case of there being a borrower ID, we can search the user by that borrower ID, make sure that they match up. And in this user object, there may be a Lendio user ID in it as well, which would make this that much faster. So basically we're saying, is there a user determined by this user object that already exists? And if there is not, we check if there's multiple organization references. So if we know that there's not a user that already exists, then we can obviously assume that there are no borrowers that already exist. So now we're just trying to check, do we have more than one DUNS number, or do we have more than one organization object in the organizations array? In that case, all of this is still the same. If yes, we have to return a response that allows the user to select which organization they're wanting to apply for. So this means that we can't create a borrower record because we don't know what we're creating it for. So we're going to return the DNB data for all organization references, so for all of those organization objects here, but not the Lendio entities because we don't have them yet. So we hit the DNB API plus with those organization objects. So the name and address is really all we're going to look it up by. And then we're going to return back to the front end an org select state where we're also going to respond with our JWT token that we created, the user that we just created or fetched from our embedded service, and the collection of organizations that will now be those organization objects that were enriched by the DNB API. But we have still yet to create any kind of borrower. So we store that JWT in session storage, and we go ahead and it says local storage, but we're going to store the response state, the user that came back, and the organizations array in our DOM app. And if it is an org select, which in this case it would be, we are going to render the select organization component, which has both of the organizations, or all three, or all 10 that we have to choose from, and they need to select a single one that they want to be making their loan application on behalf of. So then we make an authorized post again, but this time it's using the user endpoint, using the user ID in the wildcard from that user object that was just returned. And this is a auth protected route, and it's using the JWT to pass this in. So we go to the and actually I think that may be wrong. Give me 2 seconds while I go through this. Sorry, I'm just checking Postman right now to see what I have in Postman because I think this has been updated. So if we look at embedded, sorry, I'm just off screen trying to sort through this. Here we go. Authorize user. Okay, yes. So this is not user ID. This is just user authorize. And the reason why we don't need that wildcard is because the user ID is on the token. So you can't determine what user you're attempting to authorize when you're using the JWT. The JWT determines who you're trying to authorize. And we're passing in the organization object that was selected. And if you remember from this part of the flow, this part of the Bootstrap execution, we have already enriched these organization objects with Dun and Bradstreet data if the org that was provided was able to be identified. We've already enriched them. So when they select it and we pass it back into Bootstrap, we're passing in an organization object that already has a DUNS number associated to it. So we hit this again, and now we say, is the user / borrower already exist? It would still be no because we haven't created those records. Is there a multiple organization reference? And that would be no, because now we've passed in this organizations array is a length of 1. There's no duns, and so we only have one organization to deal with. So we go ahead and create the user and the borrower using this user object, and we're also using the organization. So this user object, embedded service is going to handle that, and it's going to take the claims off of the token to go ahead and populate the user object. And then the organization obviously is the object that was selected. And so this one says create the user and borrower using the DMB response, or if none found, with the minimum address provided in the payload. A DUNS number in the payload would always be expected to return organization data from DMB, so we'd assume we'd always have more than a minimum set of data. An organization object in the payload with the DUNS number included was populated by the previous bootstrap, so we've already gone over that. So this is going to return a user, borrower, and an organization, but in fact, it's going to return this. So this has all been updated. So I'm going to put this in here instead. There's some updates from our conversation with Seth primarily, when we were talking with Brian, Seth, and Stouty, where we can go ahead and create those borrower values immediately. And then when we return the borrower with the borrower values, we would know then what questions are left to ask on the application, I believe. So in this case, we go back to this point. So the response from the Bootstrap endpoint comes back to embedded service. Embedded service then updates the user record with the Lendio user ID that was just created. And this borrower ID, I'm not going to change it right now, but if we come up with a mechanism where we do mark an active borrower ID, this is when we would update that. And then we mint a new JWT token that has the additional claims that were just updated. So we would add the borrower ID on the token, and we would add the Lendio user ID onto the token. So now we would return a success state, the new token, the user object, which is the new embedded user, and then a Lendio object, which has a bunch of nested entities in it. So it'd be the Lendio user, the Lendio borrower, deals, all the other stuff that we may need. So this would be updated. I think we would need borrower values along with that borrower, sounds like. And then, open deals, and nested in those deals would be offers. So we go ahead and store that, and we replace the old JWT that we had stored in session storage with the new one that has the new IDs in the claims for subsequent requests. Let's go through the other flows that were just added. So in the case that a user and borrower already exists when we make that initial authorize request. So just a refresher, we've gone through the third party. It came back, token was valid. They came back with some organizational data. So we make a request to Bootstrap, and the user and borrower already exist. Okay, cool. So the first thing that we do is we're going to fetch the user. If there's a borrower ID in the request, then we're fetching the borrower for that ID. So this borrower ID is intended to be able to be passed into the request in the event that we already know the borrower that we're choosing to represent. So in the case of having that last active borrower ID somewhere on the user or somewhere in our embedded service, we may want to default to that. And the way that we would default to that is we would just pass it into the Bootstrap request. And then the Bootstrap request wouldn't worry about anything else that came in. It would only need that ID. And as long as it's related to the user that we're fetching data on, we would just choose that and we'd be good to go. The other cases are if the organization's array is a length of 1, and the organization in the organization's array has a borrower ID. What that would mean is that the organization, the data did not come from this access response. It came from a selection over here because that's the only way that we have a borrower ID on that organization object. And it means that somebody has already selected. So if it's a length of 1 and there's a borrower ID in the organization, then we know that this is a borrower. And so that is a single reference. Or if an organization was selected and there's a selected parameter, so this is a length of 1, and it was selected, we can go up here. If the DUNS or the organization array's length in the request payload, we have to fetch DNB data using DUNS numbers, names, and addresses provided. So basically what we're saying is there is the possibility of a user already existing that has many borrowers. If they have that selected equals true, we don't need to go fetch all their borrowers because it means that we've already gone through that process. And what they chose was not an existing borrower, but an organization that represented a borrower that does not yet exist. So everything below this, once we've come through, if any of those conditions are met, we can just go ahead up to this next step where there are not multiple organization references. But if any of those conditions are not met, or if those conditions aren't met, we're going to fetch the DNB data using the DNB API Plus with the organizations provided in this array. We're also fetching all the borrowers for that user at this point because we don't have a selection. And so we're going to try to dedupe any of our existing borrowers for this user with the organizations that were provided by the third party and or input. If any of them match by address, we can say that this organization in this organization's array is mapped to this borrower that already exists. So what we'll have them select is not the organization object. We can do away with that organization object. We can represent that organization that was given to us by the third party as the existing borrower. So the whole idea is we're trying to reduce these collections, these arrays. So multiple organization references can be defined as the third party organization or DUNS arrays have a length of less than or equal to 1, and the borrower's length is equal to 1, and the third-party organization cannot be matched with the existing borrower. Well, now we have two choices. We have the borrower that already exists, and we have the organization that the third party gave us that does not exist as a borrower yet. The second case would be a third-party organization list here is less than or equal to 1, and the borrower's length is greater than 1. So if there's 2 borrowers, we're definitely, we have at least 2 to choose from. And if there was an organization in the array of organizations that we can't match to a borrower, well, we may have 3 or 4 choices, 2 of which being organizations that don't represent an existing borrower and 2 that do represent an existing borrower. The other would be the inverse of that, where there is more than one organization in the organizations array, and there's a single borrower, and either that borrower can match one of the organizations in the array or none. So we'd have a minimum of 3 to choose from, possibly 2 that are organizations that don't represent a borrower that already exists, and 1 that represents a borrower that exists. Or maybe that borrower does match one of the organizations in the array, and so we can reduce it by 1, and so there's 2 choices. But either way, there's still choices to be made. Or the borrower's length is greater than 1, and the organization DUNS length is 0. Then we just return the borrowers to choose from. Okay, so in the case that there are multiple organization references, so we can only reduce it so far, we go back to this solution here, where it's an organization select. So we go through the same process where they select from the borrowers/organizations that we've given them. And if they're organizations, their data has been enriched by the DNB API already. So they make their selection. They have that JWT token, like we had talked about before. They make the authorize request again through the user object with that selected organization. We provide that selected organization in this organizations array. So now it's an organizations array of one. And that organization, if it was selected and it wasn't a borrower, there'd be a parameter of selected equals true. And if it was, we'll probably have selected equals true either way on there. But if it's an organization that has a borrower ID in it already, that is proof enough that it was selected. So we actually don't need the query param in those cases. But either way, now we get here. Is there multiple organization references? In this case now, there's not. So has user and borrower organization selected? If borrower, so we've already fetched the user. So now we're looking for if there was a borrower in this, if that organization that was passed in is a borrower, so it has a borrower ID, then we just go through the DUNS check. If there's a DUNS number that already exists for that borrower that was selected, we can go ahead and fetch data from DNB, see if we can find it if one doesn't exist, or update it if one does exist. If no DUNS number exists on the borrower DUNS, we can go ahead and update it. If there is no borrower, meaning the object that was passed in has not yet been created, we can use the organization's payload, which would have been DNB enriched already if we were able to identify it, to go ahead and create a new borrower. And using that DNB enriched data, if any came back, we can create as many borrower values as data that we have available to do so. So we can also, if there was a DUNS response, when we originally tried to enrich this organization object, we can go ahead and create that borrower DUNS entry for this organization, or sorry, for this borrower now. And we'll return the user, the borrower values, deals, offers, everything else that we may need on the front end. So the things that have changed here, obviously, are multiple organization references when a user and borrower already exist, but then also the idea of when we have organization data and we're hitting this DNB API, we're going to try to create borrower values already. So then what comes back to the DOM app is a borrower that has already taken all of the answers to the questions that we have available. And so we would just know what is missing by virtue of what borrower values we do and do not have. So then when we make another submission that Seth was talking about, the API should be able to determine what questions we're still in need of, just simply by virtue of the organization and the borrower, sorry, that we created and the borrower values that we created on behalf of that borrower. That was a lot. Let's talk about it.